Hi, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DLA Ignite. With me today, I've got Augustine Fou. I'm really excited about today. I've been looking forward to this. You are the expert on ad fraud, the go-to, and we're going to talk about ad fraud. But before we do that, tell people where they can get hold of you.
All right. Thanks, Tim. From the title of the talk, you can see my Twitter handle is ACFOU. Usually pretty active on Twitter. And also, if you want to read some of the articles I post on LinkedIn, literally just look up my name, Augustine Fou, on LinkedIn, and feel free to connect or follow. So those are my two primary places for publishing information.
Yeah, and so as some people English may not be the first language, it's AUGUSTINE, and then it's FOU. And I can assure you, if you want to know about ad fraud, go to Augustine's LinkedIn profile. There is article after article, and it's really insightful. I mean, this is how I found you and wanted to get you on here because, to use the American term, there's no BS. But before we get into talking about ad fraud, I mean, you are well known, well known for it. How did you get into it? What is it that sparked your excitement about it and passion about it?
Well, I would say that I'm a digital marketer first and foremost, but I'm also a scientist, and I like to ask questions. So when things didn't make sense, like some of the analytics started looking strange to me, I dug deeper. So I didn't wake up one morning and say I wanted to be an ad fraud or research ad fraud, but it just became, the further I dug into it, the more extensive I found it to be. So it's really the intersection between technology and marketing. And too often we might have great technologists or developers or coders who know the code very well, but they're not necessarily marketers. And vice versa, we have marketers that are not very technical. So I happen to be kind of right in the intersection of the two, and it became a good area for me to focus on. And so, I would still say I'm a digital marketer, but the fraud part is where, we really have to focus on solving that first. Otherwise, we're not really doing digital marketing properly. I'll get into this later, but, if you look at some of the analytics and you're seeing 5% click-through rates, 10%, 50% click-through rates, you can't use any of that for proper marketing because those are not real humans clicking on your ads. Those are bots. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but that's kind of why I fell into it and have been studying it ever since.
Because we've all heard about, like farms, where there's people that just like stuff. And, I've spotted people on Twitter buying likes and followers and stuff like that. But what is digital ad fraud? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so it's related to all those fake accounts and fake likes and all that kind of stuff. So you might have read in New York Times, they did a big piece on influencer fraud, right? So there are people who, supposedly have a lot of influence because they have a ton of followers. But what if a bunch of those followers were not actually people, right? So that's a form of fraud. So in this case, what I'm talking about is digital ads. So for example, when, 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, when digital advertising first started, you would go to a website like yahoo.com. And when you visited the page, there would be ads that load. So normally you would just assume it's a person going to a website. And when they look at pages, you would see the ads. But fast forward to, today, when we have programmatic advertising tech, we call it ad tech for short. You now have ads that can run on hundreds of thousands of websites, most of which people have never visited, right? These are sites that no one even knows about, but yet they're selling millions and millions of ads. So we call these long tail websites because they're not the mainstream ones like New York Times or Wall Street Journal or big ones that people would instantly recognize. They're just domains out there that probably don't have a lot of humans going there. So how do they generate the ad impressions? They're basically using bots or software programs that repeatedly load the web pages to cause the ads to load. And so now they can generate those ads fraudulently by the billions, right? Again, we kind of think about how many humans are there on Earth, how many humans go on websites all day long, and how many pages can they possibly look at every time they go onto websites, right? Some of those numbers just don't add up anymore when we're talking about the trillions upon trillions of ads being sold, bought and sold programmatically now. So there's been a disconnect to the number of actual humans that are alive on Earth, right? And the number of ad impressions that continue to grow. So I think common sense will start to tell you that something other than humans are generating those ad impressions. And that's where we get into the fraud part of it. And the marketers think they're buying, ads shown to humans, but they're actually not.
And if we think about it, there's only so many people that could be sitting there going, load the page, load the page, and load the page.
Yeah.
So why not automate that with a bot?
Correct. These software programs can pretend to be browsers. They can pretend to be mobile devices. You've probably seen some kids who are playing these online games. They have aimbot and they have other bots that help them click or shoot or do something to help them cheat and win the game. So those bots operate in logged in environments, right? Those users basically pay for those bots to help them cheat and win. So, there's been an assumption that, if you're in a logged in environment, there's no bots, but it's very easy for bots to be logged in as well and pretend to be, a human doing all those actions. And a human can't click 60 times a second, right?
No.
But a bot can, the software program can.
Yeah. So how big is this? What is the size of ad fraud then?
So a lot of people have attempted to quantify it, and I'll put it this way: it's very big. And the reason I can't say a specific number, or I won't say a specific number, is that measuring fraud is hard in the sense that you don't know what you don't know. No. You don't know if you got everything. And if the new revelations are any sign, right? Literally every single year we see the new largest ever botnet being discovered, right? So next year we fully expect to see yet another largest ever botnet being discovered. So the point is, we don't know if we got everything. So it's really hard to accurately report the quantity of fraud. However, if we flip it around and say, okay, so what of the digital advertising can you actually confirm to be real? Let me give you a ratio that I tend to use. So it's 10% of the dollars I can verify, and 1% of the impressions I can verify, right? So that means the flip, the other 90%, I don't have to say it's fraud or not. I just can say, I can't really verify that for sure, right? It just went somewhere else and we don't know. Or the other 99% of the impressions went to some other sites that, unless you've actually checked millions upon millions of sites to see if they're real, you really don't know. So I use those ratios, 1090 and 199 to describe, okay, it's a really big problem. Now, bottom line is, over the last 8 years of my doing this, no matter how big the number we tell people it is, right? It could be 9 billion, it could be 11 billion, it could be 22 billion. And I think eMarketer said recently it could be 44 billion by 2022 or something. Those numbers are so big, and the people who don't care about it and don't want to know about it are not going to be motivated no matter how big the number you tell them. So it really boils down to whether the marketer actually wants to look into it, right? If they're satisfied with, oh yeah, we buy all sorts of fraud detection and they all tell us fraud's low, so it's cool, we'll just keep buying. Those are not the people who actually want to know. So I could talk myself blue in the face and they still won't do anything, right? They just think that they're already doing everything, and so they just keep doing what they're doing. So again, it's a very hard number to actually pin down, because there's new forms of fraud that we haven't accounted for yet.
And I think that you've said in the past about fraud detection that there's different types of fraud detection because there's different types of fraud.
Yeah, it comes down to something pretty basic. Over the years, we've seen a crop of fraud detection tech companies spring up to help address this problem. And of course, we're better off having them than not having any of them at all, right? Because at least we're catching the basic fraud. But if those technologies are tuned to looking for bots, they'll only find bots, right? And so typically it's a bot hitting a web page, right? That's kind of the old way of the fraudsters generating ad impressions. But now think about the shift of dollars into mobile, into mobile apps, into video, into CTV, into OTT. In the case of a mobile app, for example, like a flashlight app or a keyboard app that's committing fraud, it's not technically a bot hitting a web page. So if the technology for detecting fraud is tuned for looking for bots, they're not going to find any of it, right? Because these are just literally the flashlight app that's committing the fraud, or the keyboard app. Like, where do you see an ad on a keyboard app, right? You don't. You use the keyboard. And as it turns out, most of those ads are being loaded in hidden browsers in the background, so the user never sees it anyway. But they're able to do that in very large quantities because on a mobile device, the device is always on, right? You never turn off your mobile device, and it's always got an internet connection. So basically, in those cases, it's super convenient for the bad guys to use mobile apps to commit a ton of fraud, and the user won't even know. And furthermore, by having it actually on a real device, it's going to appear to be a real device. And so the fraud detection company won't detect that it's a fake device, so therefore they won't detect it and catch it and stop it. So I think in those cases, when the fraud detection companies are reporting fraud in the 1% to 3% range, great, bots are in the 1% to 3% range. But a lot of dollars have already shifted over to mobile, CTV, and other forms that aren't, these technologies are not tuned to looking for fraud.
So if we take a step back, though, and look at digital advertising, I mean, when we talked about this to prepare this, you talked about organizations such as P&G, Chase, and Uber that actually stepped back from digital advertising.
Those are great examples. I think it's a very hard thing to ask a marketer to do, which is to turn off their spend and see if there's any change in business outcomes. But given the current virus crisis, a lot of companies have, in fact, turned off their ad spend. And if their sales didn't go down, now some of the sales going down might be due to the virus, right? People are just not buying clothes that much more, that much these days, or jewelry or other types of products. But if the sales didn't go down when you turn off your digital marketing, then whether or not it's fraud, the digital marketing wasn't driving any incremental sales for you anyway, right? So you mentioned those couple of examples. Back in 2018, when P&G turned off $200 million of their digital spend, there was no change in business outcomes. In fact, for that quarter, I think it went up or something, right, by a few percent.
I remember being in the press. It went up, yeah.
Yeah. So we can't say it was caused by that, but we can just say during that same time period, right, it went up. And then same thing for Chase. So what they did is they cut their programmatic reach from 400,000 websites to 5,000 websites, pretty much a 99% decrease in reach. They saw no change in business outcomes. Right? And then similarly with Uber, when they turned off their digital spend, they were basically paying mobile networks to help them get more app installs. But the difference was a lot of humans would actually install the Uber app because they wanted to install the Uber app, not because they saw an ad. Right? So a lot of those app installs were actually fraudulent. So those mobile exchanges were basically simulating or fabricating the reports that said, okay, we got this many app installs for you. And the reason they did that was Uber was paying on a cost per install basis, right? So they weren't paying on the number of ad impressions. They weren't even paying on the number of clicks. They were paying only when they got the outcome that they wanted, right? So you would typically call that performance marketing. You would only pay for the outcome, in this case, the install of their app. So if you're paying for that, the fraudsters are smart enough to do exactly the thing that you're paying for. So if they know they can get $10 a pop for every app install they generated, they're going to go generate those app installs. Now, in the Uber case, there was a mix of both real fraudsters who actually simulated the app install, meaning they had fake mobile devices download the app and install the Uber app. And then there were other fraudsters that literally fabricated the Excel spreadsheets. They didn't even go through the trouble of simulating the app install. They would just create this Excel spreadsheets and send it back to the agency, and the agency would give that to Uber saying, oh, you got this many installs, pay us the bounty per install, right? So fraud is that rampant, and it's also that easy. So the question is, why wouldn't any fraudsters or any criminal for that matter spend a lot of their time doing this? Because it's definitely much safer than trying to rob a bank with a gun.
Yeah, it would seem so, yes. So why hasn't it been solved?
Great question. I get that question all the time. It hasn't been solved because no one wants to. So let me talk about kind of the supply chain. So on the one side, you have publishers or site owners or app owners that are trying to sell ad impressions. On the other side, you have the marketers who are spending money to do digital marketing. And in the middle, you have all the middlemen, right? From ad exchanges that are supposed to kind of help buy and sell the ads to other ad tech companies that are helping you do ad targeting and layer on data and things like that for targeting purposes. So pretty much everyone loves the volumes that fraud generates. Right? So think about the ad exchange. They make more money when there's more volume of ads being bought and sold through their exchange. So even though they say they're looking into it, or they might even have anti-fraud teams or security teams, they're not in a huge rush. Let me put it that way. So I think they mean well, but they're also not going to be in a huge rush to solve the fraud if that means lopping off 50% of their revenues, right? That's too big of a hit to their top line and to their bottom line. And then similarly for the fraudulent sites that are buying the traffic, they'd love to believe that the traffic's all real, right? Just think about this. Are there a whole bunch of humans with nothing to do but to go to the specific websites that you tell them to go to in mass quantities so you can generate lots and lots of ad impressions, right? I don't think you can get a whole bunch of humans to do that. But you can very reliably get a botnet to go hit that website and specific pages on it X amount of times, right? And basically those botnets that were previously used for DDoS attacks, right? They can generate enormous quantities of traffic, right? I call it a traffic fire hose. They can now just point that traffic fire hose to whichever website pays them for that traffic, right? And so that is a very reliable way of getting the traffic, whereas you can't rely on humans to do that for you, right? So when they do that, those sites depend on fraudulent traffic that isn't marked as fraudulent, right? They get by the fraud detection company, so they get marked as valid anyway. So everyone loves to see those large volumes. So they don't want any of that to go away. So that's why they don't want to solve fraud. And the last piece is, you would think, why would the marketers want this, right? You would think it's their money, they're spending it. Shouldn't they want to prevent waste? So yes, of course they want to in theory, but if you're a marketer, say, for example, a brand manager at a big CPG company, your job is to spend it all, right? You were given $60 million, $100 million to spend. There wasn't enough inventory for you to buy if you just went to the mainstream publishers, because in those cases, there's a finite human audience and those audiences don't grow very much, right? So you end up going to programmatic exchanges where they'll tell you, oh yeah, sure, we can sell you, 10 billion impressions, 50 billion impressions, 100 billion impressions, and it's even cheaper, right? So when you hear that as a marketer or their media buying agency, what are you going to do, right? You're going to go buy more quantity at lower average price. That's kind of like the Costco mentality, right? You can buy a lot of toilet paper at lower unit price at Costco. So I think some of the marketers and their media agencies are kind of using that Costco mentality and buying mass quantities. But by doing so, they're exposing themselves to more fraud, because the only people that can actually sell you mass quantities of impressions at very low cost are the fake sites. Right? The real publishers have cost of content because they have real journalists they have to pay. They have real editors, right? So there's a cost of creating that content. And I think some of the stuff we're seeing right now with the virus-related stuff is that the news organizations are getting hurt a lot, right? Because they can't sell their ads at lower cost. And furthermore, some of the brand safety tech right now is actually blocking keywords. So any news organization that has to write about the virus-related news can't even show ads on those pages, right? So it's kind of like a circle where all this bad stuff is happening. The good publishers are going out of business, whereas the fake sites continue to make money off of digital ads, right? So that's a long way of saying we haven't solved fraud because everyone loves the volumes that it generates. So even though they're not the ones running the botnets or committing the fraud themselves, they're benefiting from the flow. So they're not in a hurry to shut it off.
And so what can the average marketer do about this?
They can do very simple things. It's like, I don't think my tech is that sophisticated. It just gives me the right data to look at. So let me give you an example. When we put our tag into the ads, right? So again, I maintain my own tech platform because I don't trust anyone else's data. And for example, in the Uber case, you can see even the log files were tampered with, or even the Excel spreadsheets that are shown to the client are tampered with or fabricated, right? So I can't trust any data coming from anyone else. So I have my own tech platform, and we use it for both publishers and marketers. So publishers use the on-site tag so that they put it on their own site, and we can look at the traffic coming to the site and see what portion is bots versus not. And then for the marketers who don't have relationships with millions of websites, meaning they can't put their tag on the site, they would use the in-ad tag. And so that means the tag rides along with the ad impression, and then those ads get served onto hundreds of thousands of websites. What we do with that is we collect JavaScript parameters so that we can kind of analyze the user that caused the ad to load. So in that case, the JavaScript parameters are just like what Google Analytics would collect. But instead of using it for quantity purposes, like how many page views, how long did they stay, we're actually triangulating two or more parameters together to look for discrepancies. So again, I'll use ultra simplistic examples just to illustrate here. If the browser is pretending to be an iPhone browser, but the screen resolution, which is a different JavaScript parameter, if the screen resolution is like 1920 by 1080, that's a desktop monitor. That's not an iPhone screen resolution. So that discrepancy becomes a red flag. If the IP address is a data center like AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, that's another red flag, right? Because humans don't access the internet through data centers, right? They're usually at home on their cable modem. So when we accumulate 3 or more red flags, then we mark that specific impression as fraudulent, right? So that's a technique that we use to confirm that something is fraudulent. And there's many, many more accumulated over the years, but those are just examples. And one other key thing that we do is we look for humans. Because, for example, if a fraud detection company says, oh, it's 10% bots, most people just assume that the other 90% is humans and not bots. But in the data, what you'll notice is that there's a large portion, or there's a portion that is not even measurable, right? Because sometimes there's ad blockers at play, so they block the ads and they block trackers. Or the bots are smart enough to block the detection tags, right? They know this is a double verified detection tag or an IS detection tag, so they won't let it run. They won't load it so that they can't get detected. So in those cases, if the fraud detection tech doesn't report on the portion of data that's not measurable, they're significantly misreporting the percent of bots. And just to close out on the other side, we have to measure for humans as well, because we actually have to positively confirm that it's a human who interacts with a page or does something on their mobile device or clicks something, right? So for example, when we see a click and we don't see a corresponding mouse movement, how is that possible? A human actually has to move their mouse to the ad before they click it. If we see a click without a corresponding mouse move, something's wrong with that, right? So that's just an example to illustrate that if the marketers actually looked at the data themselves, and even their own analytics, they'll be able to see telltale signs of something wrong. They will be able to solve a lot of this fraud themselves without needing any kind of specialized fraud detection tech, right? So it's almost like, let's start with the fundamentals. Let's have marketers look at the data themselves and, not just assume that everything's fine because their agency told them everything's fine. What do you think the agency is going to tell you? They're going to tell you everything's fine. So you keep spending with them. Right. So I think a lot of common sense will be very helpful in the marketers actually solving some of this, the most obvious fraud themselves first.
That's fantastic. So we've actually got some watchers. I don't know if they want to ask any questions. We do actually have one point made by Michael M. I don't know if you can see that, Augustine.
Yeah.
But I think he was actually confirming what you were saying.
Yeah, I think procurement, on the one hand, they're trying to help the marketer get better prices and stuff like that. But in this case, getting better prices, which means lower CPMs, may actually mean exposing them to more fraud. So again, going back to the earlier example, where can you actually get CPMs that low? it's actually from fake sites that basically plagiarize their content, or the sites don't even exist, right? So in that case, they can afford to sell you the ad impressions at very low cost because they have no cost of content, right? So compared to real publishers, that they can't sell it for a much lower cost. And here's another kind of thing that I get told every time. Oh, now fraud is priced in because we're buying ads at much lower price. So yes, we know there's fraud, but no, we don't really care. So they usually say, oh, we're buying ads at $3 CPMs now, whereas we used to buy ads at $30 CPMs from the big publishers. And they think, oh, well, now it's only 1/10 the cost. We can absorb some fraud. We don't care, right? But in this case, let me kind of play it back. Previously, when you bought ads at $30, you bought a certain quantity. But now when you're paying $3 CPMs for the ad impressions, you're buying 10 times more quantity. So you're still spending $30 total. You're not actually spending any less, right? So in that case, when you're spending $30 and only buying $3 CPM inventory, pretty much all of it is fraudulent. That's the only way you can get that kind of quantity, right? So it's kind of a misnomer or misconception to think that, oh, fraud is priced in because I'm paying lower CPMs. And sometimes procurement kind of forced the marketer to go that way because they're trying to get lower and lower cost. So they're saying, oh, who can get me lower CPMs? And of course, when the agency goes out to the open exchanges, they're going to get lower CPM inventory. And when they mix that in, it just looks better, but you're actually exposing yourself to more fraud. So I think if they just go back to buying ads from legitimate publishers, from mainstream publishers that they can actually meet and sit across the table from, that would be a whole lot better, because those publishers actually have real human audiences because they have real content.
Right. And it's been shown in that the articles have been in the press, hasn't it, around the fact that mainstream publishers like the Financial Times, the New York Times, people, the responsible press, are having difficulty selling the ad space around their.
While people are too focused on CPM, right?
While I still find advertising, that advertising annoying, at the end of the day, it pays for part of the fact that people have got to have earn a wage.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the original contract of the internet, right? Most consumers understand that if they get content for free, they're going to see ads in exchange. But where it started going wrong is when programmatic started taking off, right? So publishers, now I'm not talking about the good ones, I'm talking about the unscrupulous ones, right? Maybe not the ones committing fraud outright, but the unscrupulous ones will say, oh, well, we can increase our own revenue by just loading more ads on the page, or refreshing the page every 5 seconds, or refreshing the ad slot every 2 seconds, right? So there's this line that some website owners will cross, will say, oh, well, we can make more revenue, And so once they started doing that and sticking 15 ads on the page or 25 ads on the page, I've seen 94 ads on the page, right? Some hidden, some not, but that's what's starting to annoy the consumer to the point where they are going to start adding their own ad blockers, right? They have to defend themselves. And that's not even talking about the ad trackers, right? So some of the mainstream publishers have added trackers to their sites because a lot of ad tech companies came in and said, oh, well, if you add our tracker to your site, we guarantee you're going to make more money. But what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is that all the publishers, the mainstream publishers, have seen less and less revenue, right? So they've seen top line declines, and they've also seen margin compression, right? So they can no longer sell their ads at $35 when there's all a bunch of, all these sites over here on programmatic exchanges offering ads at $3 CPMs, right? So not only have they seen their top line go down, they've also seen their bottom line get compressed. So everything that we've seen has been harmful to legitimate publishers and has enabled, website owners that came out of nowhere, meaning fraudulent sites, right? How can a site that was registered a month ago be selling 100 million impressions per day, right? Common sense will tell you something's wrong with that. You need to look into it. But conveniently, most marketers, especially the bigger ones, they just hand off, $50 million to their media agency and don't look again. So that's why I said earlier, if a marketer actually started looking at their own data and looking at the analytics, common sense will tell you where to look further, right? Where, okay, this just doesn't make any sense. And then when you start digging into that, you'll kind of go through what I went through for the last 8 years. You'll find the fraud right there, occurring in broad daylight. And then you can start to mitigate some of that yourself.
And in a world where we've got organizations not necessarily having, we don't know when we're going to get out of this. And cash is important, and preserving cash is important. And we have to look at the cost of sale and the cost of marketing and work out what's working and what isn't.
Yeah. Perfect time for them to run these experiments, right? Prior to all the virus stuff happening, right? I couldn't convince many marketers to actually turn off their ad spend and see what happens, right? P&G did it, Chase did like something like that, and Uber did that. But not all marketers can turn off $100 million of spend. Okay, so just turn off $100,000 of your digital spend and see if that leads to any change in business outcomes. If there's no change in business outcomes, turn off the next 100,000 and keep running that experiment until you see a change. And now with the virus crisis, right, there's plenty of reason for you to actually turn off your marketing spend and see what happens, right? And if there's no change in business outcomes, no change in sales, then you know that none of that digital spend was driving incremental business outcomes anyway.
Yeah.
So then you really need to rethink turning it all back on, right? You may not need to turn all of it back on. My best guess is if you turn back 10% of your current spend, you'll be fine. And that goes back to my 10/90 and 199 ratios before.
I agree. I think that there are other things you can spend the money on that will give you a greater outcome. But I'm biased, so don't believe what I say.
Yeah, I mean the marketers, they're used to just spending it all, right? They really, if they don't even want the refunds, right? I've heard of cases where Google is trying to refund them the money because Google helped them find some fraud in their campaigns. They don't even want the money back because that just means they have to figure out how to spend it, right? A lot of these marketers, their incentives are misaligned because they get their bonuses based on how successfully they're able to spend all their money, right? And a lot of them are even afraid that if I don't spend it all, then I'm not going to get as much budget next year.
Well, I've worked for organizations where if you didn't spend it, basically it was taken off you.
Yep.
And if you didn't spend it, you would get less budget next year. So you spent it.
Yep. So, I mean, a lot of that, if we can change those incentives, it's going to actually allow more marketers to look into this more than they have been in the past.
That's been fantastic. Really insightful. Really enjoyed that. Augustine, tell people again where they can get hold of you.
All right. On Twitter, it's ACFOU. And on LinkedIn, it's first name, last name. So it's Augustine. It's August plus INE. And last name is Fou, F-O-U. Just look me up or Google me. You'll find all my writing from many years.
And, if you're interested in this, go and read Augustine's articles because they're fascinating. And you're
happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. And I know you're really big on social but you're very generous in, when we spoke to prep this, you shared a number of SharePoint presentations and stuff. You pretty much share everything that you've got. You are an encyclopedia in terms of the.
Yeah, I write about the phenomenon, right? I don't talk about clients, but this is how a form of fraud works. This is another example of fraud working, like frequency caps or faked geolocations, all that kind of stuff. So I talk about the phenomenon. So if more people are aware that kind of fraud can occur, they can actually start looking at their own data to see if it's affecting their campaigns. And again, I'm a fraud researcher and not a fraud detection tech company.
Yes.
Because those companies rely on fraud to continue, so they keep making money. So back when I started building the tech, I decided, okay, the revenue model cannot make me conflicted, right? So basically, I decided to be a researcher. And as opposed to those black box fraud detection tech companies, which they can't tell you how they measured it, my job as a researcher is to actually show the clients how I measured it so that they can actually understand why I mark something as fraud or not fraud. So once they understand it, then they can actually start taking action themselves.
Yeah. Fantastic. Really insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tim.
For spending 30 minutes with us. And thank you also from Michael M as well. He's just given you a little note.
All right.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you on LinkedIn. Thanks.
All right. See you later.
Bye.